Send you a tape that I promised many months ago, but we got involved in several things, including 2 trips this fall. But now I'm ready to try and answer some of your questions. And as I said in my note to you many months ago, I would probably try to do it chronologically. Now my name is Shell Everett Martin. It's M-A-R-T-I-N. First name is just S-H-E-L-L. Many people wonder why, but I might say that most people who knew me in school or in the neighborhood in Warren County, Spring Creek, and in Corry will remember me as Everett Martin. The reason for that is that my father's name was Shell Albert Martin, and I was named Shell Everett Martin, and I went by my middle name all the time that I was in school in Spring Creek, and I remember signing my name as S. Everett Martin in the last 2 years of high school when I attended the high school in Youngsville. I was also made aware of another name that had been carried over by some of the Henry girls, because when my brother was going up there to hunt and to visit and stay with old Bill Henry and his sister, who had come back from, whom I never met, but who had come back from Alaska, and they had the farm there. He was asked who was this Shell he was going to go see when he left there in the Washington, D.C. area. And after explaining that I was the oldest boy, then the story came back to me real clear that when I started high school at the Youngsville Junior High School, it was a new school, and I was taking more or less a college preparatory course, and of course I was taking Latin 1. And the Latin teacher finally utilized a name for me to illustrate how Latin is put together. In other words, I was one of the few farm boys attending high school at that time. And everyone knew that I rode up there on the train from Spring Creek every morning and had to sort of trot in order to go from the Corry depot to the new junior high in time to attend classes. And of course I rode home in the opposite direction later in the evening and usually stayed around to do my studying at the school after classes were over. And anyhow, he told me that they remembered that the teacher had said that the formation of Latin was such, and she used me as an example, stating agricola ad portem stat, meaning that the farmer stood at the gate. So from then on, I was agricola to the junior high students and to those who moved with me after that 1 year over to the 1 year that I spent in Corry High School. So that is another name that some of the old-timers might remember me by, but I think that most of them have passed on by now, because I'm sitting here thinking that in a couple of months I will be 79 years of age, and I'm very lucky to be in as good a health as I am, the only real problem being that I cannot see very well, and not enough to see the lines on a paper or to read the paper. I can read large headlines and all with the help of strong magnification. Now, the first remembrance that I have real clearly is in the fall of 1918, when I asked my mother where my father was. And it was explained to me that my maternal grandfather, John House, and my father were on a trip to look at some property. They were considering buying a farm with a large house and quite a bit of acreage and good farming land, preferably bottom land along a creek or river. And that the idea was that my grandfather, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, and my mother's youngest brother, Victor, and my sister and myself, who were then had been born, and my mother and dad, would go there and we would farm together. And my grandfather, House, would get rid of his country store a ways out of Marietta, and I learned later that he apparently put down the down payment on the farm there in Spring Creek. It was then, not long after that, that another thing happened, which I remember also. My mother and I had gone to town with a horse and buggy to do some shopping. And on the way down Front Street in Marietta, Ohio, we were driving along, and all of a sudden there were guns being fired, tin pans and wash blowers being pounded, steamboat whistles were whistling at the harbor there, and it was a real loud, scary sound to the horse. And the horse tried to run away, was really carrying on and jump and run. My mother was having a time with it, and luckily a mounted policeman came riding up, got the hold of the reins, settled the horse down, and then actually led us and the horse, with his horse, across the Muskingum River Bridge so we could go on home. It was quite a scary time, and of course that was the first Armistice Day on November 11th, 1918. Then later, on the 11th of February, I was awakened in the middle of the night, and about the same time, my one living sister then also awakened, and we went out in this farmhouse, and we're looking down, and us through the banisters of the landing, outside of the two bedrooms, and there was a wide hallway and an open stairway coming up. My grandmother went hurrying toward the bedroom with a large pan of water, which was warm or hot because it was steaming. And since I had heard my father make the remark, I guess, anyhow, I was told later exactly what I said. My grandmother was laughing about it much later, that I hollered out in a loud voice, "What the hell is going on down there?" Well, Grandma really whipped around and wanted to know what we were doing up, ordered us back in the room, and you stay there. And I went back immediately, my sister too. I'd never seen her be so stern. It was only the next day or two that I found out that twins had been born. That was Dorothy, whom you met when she stopped by the farm there with her second husband. There was my brother Richard. My first brother was also born. They were twins. And so that is very, I also remember of having a double baby buggy and me wheeling the two babies around at the time, because just a week later, on the 18th of February, I became 6 years old and considered myself quite a grown man. I also remember that either on Thanksgiving or Christmas, my father and mother, with my sister Wilma and I in the back, I remember on a rug or something and covered up with a blanket, made a trip to Grandma and Grandpa House's place for the holiday. And I don't remember whether we stayed overnight before the holiday or not. However, what happened was my grandfather went up to take a nap after eating a very large meal. And when we were about to leave, so we'd have time, it would take by horse and probably 2 to 3 hours to get home before dark, or by shortly after dark. My grandmother went up to awaken my granddad, and as it was told to me later, he raised up out of the bed, stood up and stretched and leaned back some and was yawning, and suddenly it just went blank and fell backward across the bed. She hurried forward to find out what was wrong, checked for his pulse, and he had died of a heart attack, as had an older brother, the second oldest of my grandfather and grandmother's family, and Uncle Clarence, who of course I never met, who died when he was 12 years old suddenly of a heart attack of that type. So everything happened in a way it was not planned. And of course we were held back for quite some time by these events, and it wasn't until the fall of 1919 that we arrived in Spring Creek, and I first saw the village and the farm. My father had gone ahead riding in a railroad car containing the furniture, a cow giving milk, and a team of horses, and things like that. And he had already made a trip or two with the horses down to the farm. We got in the afternoon after spending a couple of nights at a cousin of my mother's who lived with his family in South Pittsburgh. Now I remember that my father said that he had taken the horses first on the first trip over the bridge, but that the planking had dried out some, and also they could see down through, and they were not used to a place like that, and they had to really jump the wagon wheels up over a little depression on each end due to settling of the embankment. So he took us through the lower roadway, which went across just north of all the willows and brush just up from the swamp area, which lay between our house and the main road, and really the upper end of the pasture that's down on both sides of the creek on the Hyer farm. So the idea of all of us living together didn't work out. It was not then until the following spring that my Uncle Victor, the youngest of my mother's family of brothers, she was the only girl with 7 boys that they had, and there were 6 boys living then. So Grandpa and Victor came up the next spring in 1920, and I recall then getting to see more of Spring Creek, because several times on a Sunday after church, Victor had a bicycle and would let me ride the crossbar and go up to the ice cream parlor or shop, which operated in the basement area under the southwest corner of the Donaldson Brothers General Store. It was there later that I believe it was in the fall of 1920, and Uncle Victor was there in the evening, and I believe he was past 18 at the time. And as older teenagers tend to do, they were scuffing around and showing off their prowess of wrestling around and so forth of some type. And suddenly he fell forward dead. Now I don't remember if I did know ever whether it was he who was holding and wrestling with Art Brundage, or whether it was Art was holding him, but they were trying to more or less wrestle each other around outside of the parlor after eating a bunch of ice cream. So that was another sudden blow, and of course another expense. We're going, Father taking my grandmother and the body and everything, and going back to Marietta, Ohio, where he was buried in the family plot, the house family plot, in the large cemetery there. But that is how we finally got up there, and how it came that only my grandmother was left of the house family to live with us for a while, and later she did work for an elderly lady and took care of her in Corey, and returned to Marietta sometime before we left Corey and went to Marietta. And I recall riding on the truck with the furniture and all that, and getting into Marietta on New Year's Eve. In other words, on the 31st day of December of 1931. My mother gave birth to a baby girl, a sister Hazel, and she lived for some time, was sickly, and died. And of course my folks had to take her back and bury her in the family plot in Marietta, Ohio. Then my brother Bob was born, Robert Eugene, who did go back after World War II and actually hunted and stopped by to see the Donaldson brothers at the store, and told me all about it when he came further down after being there to visit me in Northern Virginia, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where I was living while working for the Office Chief Engineers Department of the Army. And when Bob was born, they had a lot of trouble. My mother was kept in the hospital quite a while too, and he almost died. Dr. Hyer was the attending physician, and he was born in the Warren Hospital, and it was some time before they found out that my mother's breast milk was poisoning him for some reason or the other, and he did pull out and lived a very active and full life until in December of 1989 he had a stroke and was out of it pretty much for several days, and we buried him before Christmas in 1989. So the oldest, that's me, and my three sisters now are the only ones living out of that family. Then later, I might say that we had moved over to the Hyer farm after Dr. Hyer's father died. I recall that he came over to visit, and I used to tease my grandmother's house because he would bring her a little packet, or a little sack really, of peppermint candies, and which I usually got to eat. But I would tease her about having a boyfriend. But I think he died about 1922, and maybe that winter of 21-22. I just don't remember exactly when. But anyhow, the folks, grandmother's day, when the folks took my sister Hazel, who died, back to Marietta. Then we moved back from the Hyer place in the later, because we were living in on the Jackson place when my youngest sister, Elizabeth Ann, or Betty as we've always called her, was born in 1925, in the day after Christmas, 1925. So that is the history of what transpired. And of course, my grandfather Martin, who was a widower, died during this period of time. And a couple of I believe two of my father's sisters also died. And so there was quite a lot of expense necessary traveling back and forth from my father and my mother. And then on one of them, I know that the whole family went, and I think that was when we'd moved back from the Hyer farm, and I had somebody else coming in to do some work. There was a George Smith, I recall, that he got married and had he and his wife had a baby, and quite some time when we were on the Hyer farm in the later 1920s, George lived in our house, the Jackson home, and milked the cows and did work and so forth over there, and then helped on both farms. But I don't recall the exact details there. My father very religiously was attempting to pay back to my grandmother house the money that she and my grandfather house had put up for a down payment, I gather. I do know that I have some old records of my father's which shows that he would sell some things and immediately would write a check over to my grandmother. We didn't know as children how he was working to do that. But that really explains why, though at times I remember that in the late 20s we had as much as between $600 and $700 a month coming in from the milk sales from the cattle on the two places. We didn't ever seem to get ahead financially at all, keeping up the mortgage payments and so forth on the farm and everything. But my father and mother never let on that we were having any difficulties that way. Although I became 6 years old in February of 1919, it wasn't until the fall of 1920 that I started to school in the four-room school at Spring Creek. Because my grandmother taught me to read books and papers before I ever started school, I spent my first year in the four-room school in the first and second grade and did all the work in both grades, and moved to the other downstairs room where the third and fourth grade was held. And at the end of that second year in school at Spring Creek, I was promoted upstairs to the fifth grade. So I completed the 8 years of grade school, secondary schooling, in 6 years, and was eligible to go on to high school. And I went, as I say, then to Corey Junior High for a year on the train. And then Carl Sickler drove a car, and several of us rode up, and he was in a higher grade. I think maybe he graduated. One reason we didn't have a ride the following year, but I would weave, after helping with chores, I would almost trot to get up to Spring Creek in time to go with the group, Carl driving the car, to the senior high school, the old senior high school in Corey. And I completed the second year there. Now, from the time I got out of school in the spring of 1928, in May, until the fall of 1929, I did not go to school at all. For one reason, my father had developed some blood poisoning, and then also we were in the process of finishing up a lot of work on the barn on the Hyer place and getting that done. So there just wasn't any way hardly for me to go to school. The way things worked out, my father didn't feel that he could afford to keep me in some town to go to high school, and but I remember that I heard later Les Donaldson, for one, put a lot of pressure on my father to get me back in school, and so they did arrange, and a woman who had grandmother of Ailsa Donaldson, the Donaldson family that lived over on the road that leads toward the Mitchell place, went down, and my father knew this elderly man who lived in a small house in Youngsville, because they were both Spanish-American War veterans, and he used to pick him up to take him to meetings in Warren of that association. Anyhow, we spent the one winter down there, and I got through my junior year of high school, and things worked out so that I finally packed my little bag and left home in the fall of 1930, and hitchhiked to Youngsville. Finally got a job in an Irishman's restaurant down there, lived upstairs, and got my meals, $5 a week, and my laundry and all was done. And that was old Bill Brady's restaurant, which is no longer there because I looked for it when I drove through Youngsville. And I even looked for the old high school, the white high school, and none of that was there. I guess, like Spring Creek, most of the old places in Youngsville have been torn down. So I did graduate from high school at the end of May in 1931 at Youngsville. Bill Mitchell got me to go with him and work for his brother Leon Mitchell over north of Youngsville, and Bill and I operated a thrashing machine tractor there for several months, and traveled around with that and got paid by Leon. And during this time, my folks sold the farm, and it wasn't until early fall that I went to join my mother and father at a house they were renting in Corey, and my father was working at a job he'd gotten with a contractor painting the high towers and buildings and everything over at the Teachers College. It was then, I believe, in Meadville, Pennsylvania. After starting school in Youngsville in my junior year in high school, which was the winter of, or school year of 29 and 30, I was made aware by the teacher of English and American literature that the National Forensic League was holding a contest for high school students, and the idea was to write a speech, or as you would give it as a speech later if you were selected. Provided by the American Forensic League, and the subjects had to do with the effect of something in American history, and that was one that had to do with our Constitution, the effects of various things on the changes in the Constitution. And I selected the effect of the Civil War on the Constitution of the United States. Now, I was the only one that submitted a paper on that from the Youngsville High School, and I was a junior at the time, and lo and behold, after they were reviewed, all that were turned in northwest Pennsylvania, I think there were 6, if I remember correctly. The state was divided into 6 regions, and I was selected to go to Pittsburgh, where the Pittsburgh Press was paying the expenses, and to give my talk in competition in Carnegie Hall in Pittsburgh. And the a history teacher and the coach, athletic coach, went with me, and that was a great event for a country boy. I remember one thing very specifically, at the Pittsburgh Athletic Club, where we had a big dinner on the second evening there, of going by a private dining room and having our guide point out the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Mellon, who was eating in his private room, and you could see through and see him sitting in there all by himself, Andrew Mellon. And then, of course, I got to tour the whole Heinz Company plant and see everything that was done there to make all that canned soup and canned everything possible. And I did not win the competition, which would have sent me to Washington, D.C. to compete among people from all the states. But I did win a place, and did receive a nice loving cup and all the stuff put on the side of it, which of course gave to the school and stayed in Youngsville High School. And I don't know whatever happened to it, but because of that, when they were starting in at that time to have student councils in the school, and so I was quite a big man on campus when I came back, and it was announced what I had done. And also, I'd become known because I had a fairly good singing voice and a soprano by the name of Nellie Carr, and I, by the music teacher, were selected to entertain with a song or two at the weekly general group in the auditorium, and we would sing songs of the day in parts. And so I sort of was a so-called big man on campus who was not an athlete. as such. And when they come up to elect a president of the student council, I was going to be a senior the following year, and I'd be president the following year, starting the fall. I was the first president of the student council at the Youngsville High School. And that pretty well covers all of the historical, chronological things that happened. And I feel it's time that I start to discuss some of the things that you have asked and been wondering about. Now, I've talked about the bridge, and it was there, and from the condition that the planking was in and the subsidence of the approaches, which my father and I worked on the following, well, not fall yet, and then the following spring. And during the winter, also on the planking, we cut large beech trees at the back of the farm, behind the back knoll, as we called that, and snaked them out. My father took them somewhere to a sawmill then, and had them sawed into planks. And we replaced the planking. And in the spring of 1920 particularly, I can recall taking the reins, and my father with a scraper shovel, and I would drive the one horse we had, the gentlest. We would scoop up earth north of the roadway, I should say west of or upstream from the roadway, that goes from the bridge to the road on the Jackson place. And we also did it on both sides. It scraped up a lot of dirt and shoveled and raked it in and leveled it up. And then when we got the new planking, we put it down. And that planking was still there at the time that I last saw the bridge. And of course I realized it wouldn't be there now, but I did notice that the planking was not that bad when I was there and walked across it to see if there was anything left of the old farm, which as far as the buildings and all was not, when I was there in 1984 on the one trip that I'd made back since I left that area right after Christmas in 1931. I also know from Robert Jackson that the bridge, the iron steel bridge, was installed by his grandparents. As he told me in the early 20s, when he would come down to visit from for the day, on off day, from Jamestown to fish there in the creek. How he enjoyed, when he was a boy, coming to visit his grandparents, Jackson, when they were living and on the farm there. And also, when you looked at the such things as the doors to the music room that slid into the wall, and all the many things that were there when we first moved there, and all of the fancy surreys and buggies and everything that were in the one barn, in that one level where we stored that stuff. Apparently they had sold a lot of lumber and had a lot of money. So the bridge was put up in 1908, and that was original, as it says on the marking. Now, related to that is the question that you wrote, I think, to my sister, read your letter, when you asked about, read this letter to me, I think, over the phone, when you asked about if she knew anything about the deep holes. No, Dorothy wouldn't remember too much because being born in 1919, and she was only 11 years old at the time that we were leaving well, maybe she turned 12. Anyhow, um, at the time they left the farm, she was only 11. So she wouldn't remember much about it. However, I remember in 1919 and 1920, the winters, the 2 winters, were very severe, and the clear down to the ripples, as we called them, where the lower road went across, and the shallows, and clear down from the bridge, that was all frozen solid. You could walk clear across. And when we got a warm rain and a heavy thaw, both years, the ice piled up against the bridge, and the water would then eventually flow in under, and you would have like a mill race going down through under that ice to get out. It was backed way up and flooding clear over to the county, I should say, the township road that ran by the Hyer place and in front of our place across the creek from the road. So my belief then is that those holes were generated by that sluice action, and it was surprising that the velocity of the water that would come through the area when it got stacked way upstream. And I do know that it actually would move large rocks downstream some, and we would find them then when we went swimming below the bridge in a hole that most of the way was not over our head, but it was when you got close to the bridge. I also recall that I used to, in the mid-20s, take a dog we had and go over and maybe hunt some rabbits with a shotgun over on the Clough property and so forth, and or go coon hunting and tree a coon and take an old revolver that my father had along and maybe try to shoot a coon in the head out of a low tree, because at that time the coonskin coats were in great demand, and any decent coon hide would bring you $20 to $30 from I.J. Fox Fur Company in New York if you handled it properly and shipped them to them. And my father and I both did that at the time, and we had the time to do it. So, anyhow, up above where the Jackson Bridge is, on the Broken Straw, and this downstream from where Spring Creek branch rose into the Broken Straw, there was a deep hole, and I remember that there was some concrete, old style concrete had been poured in one spot. Also, there was evidence that some sawdust piles or something of that type had rotted down, and there was nothing around us real close, that not even any little brush. It was more or less bare. My theory, I don't know it to be true, but my theory is that probably they had some type of a sawmill there, and all that land at the Clough land had been, all the large timber had been cut off, and a lot of timber had been cut off also in earlier years on the Jackson place. So I believe maybe they were sawing up the cross ties and other stuff for the railroad and got them out, and in order to get them out of there, they actually put in some type of wooden bridge or something, and if it was put in rather solid with abutments, you would have the same type of thing happening there that happened downstream at the Meadow Bridge when the ice came flowing down there and would back up. Now this is, I believe, what led to the deep holes. Now, you ask about a little building sitting at the corner of the barn. I'm wondering what it was for, or I guess for questioning my sister Dorothy, that's what you were referring to in your letter to her, because she had been there. And that 1928 that's in the concrete, I happened to be the person who put that in the concrete while it was still wet. And that was in 1928. Now, I can't recall just when we completed the barn, but I do know in 1927, in the early spring and all that winter before, we had the stanchions in and had that large herd of cattle which filled the stanchions, and they had to place in the below the barn for the we also had a pen there for calving and a pen for the bull, which my father bought at a great expense, and I understand it was brought in from England as a thoroughbred Holstein, and it was a grown bull. I know that when we first got it, and we kept it there and all, and so that was put in as a place to cool the milk after we took it from the cattle. We had a vacuum pump and a milking machine system. We had two of those surcingle supported. Surcingle goes around over the cow's back, and this deal valve milking system that hooks in, and you could unhook then that from the cow, the udder, and from the vacuum line, and could carry that container full of milk out and pour it in to the milk cans. Now it was the plan at the time that was built that we would, and we actually tried that a little bit, there was quite a demand for milk straight from the cow, properly cooled, and had to have a very certified, very low bacteria, which meant that what you did, you used a disinfectant and really scrubbed the udder, made sure everything was clean, and then you put the milking machine on with the 4 connections to the udder, and you milk the cow, and when you pull it loose, that rubber there sealed off too, and before rubber's waiting through the suction on the cow, and take that out, pour it in. So my father had the idea of getting much more money at that time for each gallon or pound of fresh milk if it was certified milk, meaning that it continually tested free of significant bacteria. But that was the purpose in building that later. I do know that the other part of the barn, all the equipment was in the spring of 1927, because my grandmother stayed with me, and a hard man, and I more or less ran the farm for a couple of weeks while my father and the rest of the family, my mother-in-law, went down to visit, and possibly there was a funeral involved too at that time. I think there was, but anyhow, he took the whole group. He had bought a 1925 Maxwell, and they went down to Ohio and West Virginia to visit the relatives. And I recall that it was a very rainy year, 1927. They came back just before the 4th of July, and they brought 2 of my mother's brothers and their wives, but no children, I recall, back, 2 of the younger brothers who had gotten married. And my father got on me real hard that there was lots of wild honeysuckle growing all of the corn in that really three triangular, more or less, on the toward the creek side of the railroad, and upstream from the house and barn location and all. And I took him out there to show him why I couldn't get in there to cultivate. We had a riding cultivator. We had another large corn there, and we also had another place, and I couldn't for that month of June. I think we had a big flood. I remember actually going, George Smith was over on the other farm that summer, our farm, and I actually went over and we took a barn door, and I swam some and with a line and ferried the milk from the cattle we had on our own place over to the road where it was picked up by a man by the name of Tripp, who lived down just before you more or less entered what I used to think was called the canyon. I noticed when we drove down that way there was some type of a bar or something down upstream a ways from, downstream a ways from where Oak Tripp had his little spot of land, and he had a team, and he used to do two things: is pick up school children to take uptown to school, and also to take milk. And he used to take our milk, of course he got paid for it, to the creamery in milk plant, really, in Spring Creek. So I know that that was there because I recall very plainly the one night when on a Sunday night that the hard man didn't come back, and that very night when I went to start the engine, the igniter on the engine, as you cranked it, that ran the vacuum pump for the milking machine, the igniter broke and there was no way I could get another one. And I was up till after midnight milking by hand 20-some cattle. And the next day he did get back sometime during the night. The next morning he was there, so I had some help. And then I was able to take the old car and a truck we had a Model T truck, flatbed, and drive up to Corey and get the necessary part for the broke, the igniter. So I think maybe we mainly built that house in that barn in 26, 27 time. But I recall Martin Zebb. Martin Zebb and his father lived on the Zebb place, which was toward the Broken Straw from where the old Porter home was, where Bernard Porter lived as a boy. And I remember Martin Zebb being down there with the two oxen who were great. And I had our team, and we were pulling out logs upstream, up the run on the higher place, way up toward the other part. And I think this fellow had this portable machine, and a boiler was moved down there. They dammed up and got enough water and operated a steam engine and ran the sawmill to saw up the timbers and square off timbers and boards and plank 2-inch stuff and everything else that went into the building of the barn. That's the answer to that. Well, I'm talking about going upstream there, or up the run, the old run, go past the little swamp on the other side of the railroad track, and sort of bear to the right and go on around and way up in there. When we were living there, there was a shack, more or less, covering all, and protection were restored material, equipment for processing the sugar sap to make the molasses. And it was to the left. It would be back in there. I think it was setting on stones, or possibly it was concrete blocks. But they had, I can recall when the sap was running, that I would stay up all night and stay out of school for several days in order to keep that fire going to boil down the maple sap. And it was quite a sugar bush in there, and we had more or less like a little stone boat, I should say, we also used, and we could drag that. And we would take the maple sap and one horse, and we'd pick all this up in buckets. And I recall that in front of the house, I believe there was 5 and maybe 6 large maple trees. In '84, there were 2 that were smaller, and I think maybe there were 2 that were replanted because storm damaged or broke off the ones that were there. But the other ones were very large. They were so large that we put 2 and 3 sap buckets hanging on one tree. That was what was there in the mid-20s. So I imagine all evidence back in there is gone, but probably there's still evidence of a lot of large trees that were cut on the Hyer place at the back end of the Hyer place to go on up the valley. I do recall that the run what came down through there, and sometimes it was flowed and sometimes there wasn't much, but and the people who had lived then down across from the swing bridge were named Madison, and we had quite a bit of contact with them. What a memory came back to me when you sent the 4-leaf clover. Because I recall when I was young, I was told the story of the good luck from 4-leaf clover and everything, and knowing that it was unlikely that the grassy area between the wagon tracks on the road leading from the bridge and down around the front of the knoll and on up to the house and barns on the Jackson place would probably never be plowed. Wherever we plowed all the rest of that, we rotated all the crops in that bottom area. So I would find 4-leaf clover, and so that could find more in the future. I recall, and was being quite young, taking carefully with my pocket knife, digging up some dirt and the roots around that 4-leaf clover, and taking it down and planting it in that road. And so there should be, if something else didn't kill them all, there should be quite a few to be found in an area there between the house and the bridge. Also, another thing, a question about the amount of money it took to build that bridge. I think that Bob Jackson's grandparents probably ended up with quite a little money. I don't know where his father lived, if he was living at the time, but he would come down there to go fishing in the spring, particularly in Brook and Straw Creek. But I did go fishing with him. And but anyhow, there's an area, even when I was there in '84, it wasn't so pronounced, but if you look back along from the line between the Hyer pasture and Jackson Hill, look back along that slope, part way back, before you get back to where the spring is, there's a place there that in the 20s was the way to really walk up. The path went away so forth, but when it got, before you got all the way up, it was pretty bad. So I used to go up this path and then cut over and go up this area. and there was a few smaller brush in there, but there was hardly any large trees. And it looked so much like what I later saw as log slides in the west that I wondered then, and I really wonder now, if much of what was cut off of Jackson Hill, up on the flats there, where the two farms were, well, more than that, but maybe that was where they slid the logs down, like in the winter, well, just to have a source of water or some snow. There'd be no problem in starting those logs and bringing down that, because this is was sort of a depression and all, and it had been smoothed out as though logs had chewed it all right on down, and it's very possible that's why that place is there. I don't know if you can see it now, but I could still see from the bridge, looking back there, that particular area. And the wild orchids, the other things, the spring. And there's another spring on the back behind what we call the back knoll, which has a big hole down in it. And so that led to sort of a swamp area back of that knoll. And I recall having this collie dog we called Tip when we lived on our place, and the cattle would start in and they would stop at that spring to drink some water. And I could point the cattle out to old Tip and say, "Bring the cows, go, get." And she would run on back there and she would start those cows moving and bring them on, clear on up to the barn, so that we could bring them in there on the Jackson place. And we never had more than, I think, maybe 8 or 9 that were milking at a time. And but I never will forget that collie dog, how good she was trained, and how I didn't have to walk back there to get the cattle and drive them in like a lot of boys had to in those days, because I had a cow dog that really would, if they were out where you could see, she would go and get them. I never did teach her to go way back through the swamp and clear back in the heavy, large timber. Make a comment regarding what you said, that what Mildred Brundage said. And I wasn't there, but I'm sure they did have to haul the furniture across the out to the moving truck that moved them up the quarry, because we had such things as a player piano, and it was very heavy, and there was no way that the truck, they'd even trust it to come on over there and load all that stuff on, because we did have an awful lot of furniture. I remember how much we loaded out of the house, including up to piano and all, out of the house in Corey then, just after Christmas, when I got on the truck with the other driver and drove with him all the way to Marietta with all that big truckload moving van full of furniture. So I can understand that she would have said, because it was a real job to move that stuff. I believe I've already touched upon knowing a sickler by the name of Carl, and I don't remember what his father and mother's name were, but Carl Sickler was about, I think he was 2 years ahead of me in school, and completed high school in Corey. I don't know whatever became of him, haven't mentioned, but it's possible that somehow the Sickers made a deal, or someone else, to get the WPA to come in there and plant the trees on the Sicker property up on top of Jackson Hill. I mentioned Carl, or I have mentioned him already, but we were quite close at the time that I was, well, when I was about 13 and 14, and I would say he was 16, 15 or 16, but he was just a great guy. And with respect to the Beaver Dam, I believe I've covered that, but the idea that this dam was built under the Fish Commission makes me think that this was one of those deals that started, it didn't start until Hoover didn't take office until in March of 1928. No, elected in 28, didn't wait until March of 29. So if that was done by labor, it would have been done on the basis of the federal government paying the salaries of the men who came out there to work, and someone else would have to furnish the materials and equipment. Because in 1933, I worked for a while on a project in in Washington County, where Marietta is, Newport, and I recall that I told him, well, yes, I knew how to handle dynamite and all that, so I was hired the powder man. One of it is that you had the men out there working, and putting the road across a hill there, and as far as I know, it never was completed, but these men, with their drilling steel that the county had, and their sledges and all, they drilled holes and everything, and I fooled around, and I was telling them, as I looked at the rock and all, about where to drill the holes. But you know, I never did set off one charge, because my money and all was being paid, reimbursed from the not the Work Progress Administration, WPA, but by the federal government under President Hoover. So there was a lot of those jobs there for a year or two that you worked on, but you never could get the material to go any. The county didn't have the money to buy the material, but they could form a crew and send them out and get some work done, and they never did follow through while I was there with buying any dynamite so that I could do any blasting. So that was the type of thing that under the Public Works Administration, PWA, and the WPA came along then and was named to replace that, and that was done by Roosevelt when he got in and his group of people. So I'm sure as understanding of what happened there.
I don't know if that's her married name, but anyway, she lived up at the top of Eldred Hill.
The ginseng was that you mentioned. It was a lot of it on there because it was a Chinese fellow that came up and asked my father, and I was going to school at that time, but he went back in there, and my father found out later that probably he got quite a bit of ginseng, and it was very important in Chinese medicine and so forth. He already knew about that. But I went looking for it, and I found some. This was way back, along, if you go clear back of the back knoll, almost to the back part of the property line, go up the hill a little bit, where we cut all those large beech trees and things of that type. But it's something that probably, there's a lot of it there. I don't know how to describe it to you. It has a white like flower and a little, like a little bush, but it's a big root that grows for a long ways in the forest duff. I didn't answer your question. I talked about the church and another part of the tape, I believe. I didn't answer your question. I never did go to any little school in Spring Creek. When I started the school, it was the full 8th grade in a 4-room school. And then as far as Florence trip, and you talk about this, I guess you talked about Bird and Florence Porter, and I guess you're referring to the house that they were living in when I was there in '84 that he had built. Now, on east of there, not too far, was a house when back in the 20s, and there was a Tripp family living there, and I recall I never did see the man, I don't believe, but there was a Tripp girl who would have been, let's see, my oldest sister, Rama, will be 78, 11th of November. So this girl, I think, was a year or two maybe younger than Rama. But they became friends, and she was sort of a redhead. But that couldn't have been that girl, because if she's 86 now, well, I'm wondering if possibly she lived on up on the hill where they came down on the road that went past Donaldson's store down the hill and across the creek over to West Spring Creek. That'd be one thing. Possibly if she married quite young, or if she could have been an older daughter of sister of this woman. But anyhow, I'm not sure, but I believe that this girl's name, well, I don't think it was Florence, so I'm puzzled by that.
Said that in 1929.
Someone was correct about cattle being in that strip. the strip was a part of the Clough property, as far as I know, because they had no trespassing signs right at the fence between that field, the flat field that we had, and this strip, and the cattle, when they were in there, would come right up to the fence, and I've talked about that at different places in the tape, I believe. I'm just trying to catch up on what I missed out on. But that was there all the time, and up until I was last there really on the farm in the summer of 1930. So I believe that there were some cattle in there, not the bull earlier being there, and that's about all that I need to say at this time. But I think I've discussed the fact that I had the red measles first, and we were quarantined for a whole month, if I remember correctly. So now the lane that I mentioned before, that there was a dividing line. It ran from the orchard on the Jackson Place over to the Jackson Hill, and this lane, one part of it was the dividing fence between the Hyer property and our property, and then there was an extra fence put in, and I think it was wide enough that you could probably drive a team through, and all. I think we did sometime, but that was the way that the cattle got to the barn from the pasture, which on the Jackson Place, which ran all the way along the hillside, Jackson Hill, clear back to, and then went across to the north, just to the north of the second knoll toward the rear of the property. So that was the lane that I'm speaking of, and or spoke of in the first tape that I sent you. No, your thought is not correct. There was never a roadway in all the time that we had the farm up there that connected with the Clough field. In fact, the matter is that corner on the Clough side of it was so grown up with thick brush and berry bars and all, I never could get through there. And I used to climb the fence, and the old collie dog would cry and so forth, and I would actually, before I climbed the fence, I would pick the dog up and put her over the fence. And that was a real strong fence. And if it was opened up, it had to be someone that farmed, possibly, if anybody was on the Jackson farm, that farmed over on the Clough farm, while we were there, there was never any farming took place on that Clough field anywhere. So I don't know who that could have been.
And if you go.
Now, while we were there, I don't think I was over in that Clough field, but there was no roadway that went across there then. There was a roadway that was up above, and I imagine that roadway that was put in I say up above. I mean that as far it was up the Spring Creek, and about where we talked about. Well, I talked otherwise about that might be a deeper dam that they put in there, or something like that, because it. And then they needed to connect, but they had another way, and there wasn't a real road. That was the type of road that you have, farm road, we say, that you could get over. And what they did, I never saw them. They raised some oats or something in there one year, but that was mainly that open field. They mowed the hay on it. And they had the hay in there, and they hauled some grain in the wintertime. I say I never knew exactly how they got in there. But another part I talk about the little house and barn and well and everything that existed just up from that. And so I guess when they did put the dam across there and build it, they couldn't sort of go up along the creek on the west side of the creek, or something like that, and they developed a different way. But that was done after 1930. Yes, another part of the tapes here, I talk about that small house and sort of a little barn and shed and a chicken coop and a lot of things, and that was still there the last time that I was on the back end of the farm, and that was our farm, and that was in 1930.
What farm? If you ever did explore up and down along
Now, I never remember hearing, I do not remember hearing the name Greeley, or Greeley House. I've told another part of the tape the story about being over there in that area and seeing this calf or young cow or something that had been apparently had fallen in to some kind of a hole, which could have been the basement of that house. Anyhow, it gave me quite a scare one night, but I never did know. The only thing that I saw on that whole road then, when we were there in '84, I drove over there and ran across the post office. And, that was where I went in and talked to the postmaster, and I got to know where Bernard Porter lived and where Art Brundage lived. The camp, or the chimney you're talking about, did not belong to a camp. There was the original, I don't know if it's original, there was an old Hyer house that was moved back of where the Hyer house is now, and it had one of these short type of chimneys that built in the wall and it went up, and we used that for, we moved it on a little bit northwest from where it was sitting, and that was probably up, it was sitting at the, what they did was moved it about, when they built the Hyer house that's there now and was there when we moved there, they had taken this old house and it was on skids, and they moved it on back and just left it there. And so we took that and made it into a chicken house. It had the chimney, and we had a coal-fired stove in there to keep chickens from freezing in the winter. And I used to have to go out and take care of that there on the Hyer place. When I was riding, I remember when I was riding the train, that's the job I had to do when I finally get home in the evening from riding the train to Corey. My freshman year, junior high, that was one job I had to do. When it was real cold, to go out there and check that farm. But the house had a sort of a living room kitchen combination, and that's where the stove was. And then they had sort of a living room, small, and there were two bedrooms, steps up, and two bedrooms upstairs. And it was not a large house, but apparently it was still there the last time that I was down by there, which would have been in late 1931. So that's where that came from. I believe I've covered the original barn that existed there on the other side of the road, and it was still there in 31, but of course it was old, and it had a sort of a basement-like, and it had straw mouths. I talked about the truck, was the panel truck with the candy and all. That's where we put that truck when we pulled him out of the mud down near the swing bridge in that road. Now I can understand Dorothy saying that we raised potatoes and all that across that road because that was always grown up to berry bars and brush and everything. The cattle could get up there and eat around a little bit, but that was all. And I think at the road now, there is a little bit, it's been pulled over a little bit more toward the house. Not as much room between the road, I should say, and the maple trees that are there now, that is, that I saw in '84. But Dorothy, the last time she was around there, we moved from there in 29, and I think we moved out, and so she could have been, she was just been 10 years old about in a few months when we were up there. So I think she must be mistaken. Well, we had a large garden we planted there that was part of that field. I talked about where we put the old Hyer house. I guess it was a Hyer house. I don't know how long Y.G. Hyer had that place, but I think he was there for many years. But they got more money or something, and I built this house that you now live in. But we had a large garden, and that took up the space from where we set that old house back up there, and it was about 200 feet, I guess, from about where that was at on out to the road, 250, and that's width of that house and all, a little more than that. We took that out of that field, which is sort of a three-sided field, and that was the garden area. We raised a lot of potatoes and everything in there, but she might be confused by the what was over on the on our property, because the road goes up around, went up to the buildings and the barns and on the east side of the house, and across there, that whole area was our garden, and it had a lot of potatoes were grown there. In fact, we grew on the farm there. We never grew potatoes. any place except in that garden, and everything else was like sweet corn and all. That was quite an area. So I'm afraid that she maybe is thinking about what it looked like over on the Jackson place. Or it could be that we had potatoes, rose potatoes, on the western side of that garden, which was just west of the house. But I can understand that I never saw anything over there but the brush and the cattle eating grass along that fence and all. That was about it. I believe I have already covered your request for information regarding the 4 nails in the tree, and I know it wasn't in the spring, say March of shortly after my birthday in 1920 when we were up there, but I believe it was in 21 or 22. But anyhow, I started to go to school then in the fall of 20, and I think it probably was in about 1st March along in there of 1921. It could have been as late as 22. I got the red measles, the German measles, and the quarantine for months. And we have already talked about that. But that's, I do recall that they had the quarantine signs up, and state health department or someone, I don't know who it was now, but they had the report that I had, the doctors had a report that I had the measles. And so that's when we had the quarantine signs put up over the road and over on the Cook property, and I believe there also to the sort of to the southeast of the house there, beyond the or around that area somewhere, we also had that. No, I think there's nothing wrong with you. You're so interested in the history, because I am always interested. I spent more of my time in the early days when I was in school studying ancient history, and back back mainly from about the Roman Empire and those empires and all that. I was quite wrapped up in that. But I understand it, and if I could see good now, I'd probably be reading some history books, and I was always interested in how civilization in the world came about and where it developed, and then they fail and all. And it's sad to say, but I can see in my studies in the fall of Greece and the city-states, the fall of the Roman Empire, and then the Spanish Empire, and then the English, and unfortunately, I'm afraid the United States is following the same silly path, and we are already apparently starting to go downhill some. But it's not silly to be interested in history, because who was it now that said, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. I never did skate on the lagoon. There was sort of brush stuff growing up there yet. And I noted when I walked over across the bridge in '84 there that the riffles that we called it just below where the water crossing was from the house out to the township road. And but where I skated, and I never did skate very much. I wasn't a good skater, and seemed like I was always too charged. But that was around the bridge and over the deep water just north of there. And then I think I've already talked elsewhere about the frogs and how many there used to be and so forth. And we had many a good feed out of those frogs. And I used to lay on the on the Jackson Place. My bedroom was upstairs and in the front there, and I always had the window open, and you know, as soon as it got so it was freezing outside, and I'd lay there under a feather bed in cold weather and listen to those frogs when they first got started in the spring. I sure think that's great. I'm interested in the fact that the natural gas wells are there. I recall my father saying that if he had the money, he would drill a well. And I believe that was up the Dry Run area. And also we thought possibly back by that second knoll, the back knoll on the Jackson Place. And I never understood, except he thought there were possibility and looking at all that. Because he, at the time he married my mother, he was learning to drill for wells and all, and he'd already learned quite a bit and was a tool dresser actually in the Navy before he was discharged. Following the Spanish-American War, some of the Atlantic Fleet was sent. My father was in that group. Was sent over to Africa and to look for and drill, and they actually drilled down to find out if there was a place where it wouldn't cost too much to dig out the deep harbor. My father claimed, and I've had read some references to that too, that particularly Theodore Roosevelt and others had the idea that it was going to grow into a lot of trouble with the history of the slavery in the South and the North too, as far as that goes. And they were proposing to make an extra state or country over there that the U.S. would have, and they would go and give a little bit like the same concept that Franklin D. Roosevelt said that when the people offered in Alaska, you're going to give you 10 acres of land, or I think it was more than that, during that valley where they raised all the tremendous vegetables in a short period of time. But they give a black family so many acres and a mule and so forth and whatnot, and wanted to send the poor blacks, those that wanted to go, they would give them land and equipment and all, and let them go to West Africa, Liberia, and have their own state, more or less, or possession. I think it had been. But my dad used to talk about that, and he dressed tools over there. So when he came back, when he finally got out of service, they had found some gas wells up in Utica, Ohio, and that was one of the first places that we had natural gas in this country. So he went up there as a tool dresser, then got into the drilling business, and then in about after he married my mother, or just before that, he got on working out in Illinois, in south central Illinois, around drilling, and then he went to work for an oil company. It was formed by old Augustus Bush and Anheuser-Busch Brewery, and then the other was a man named Everett at the Everett Glass Works in Cincinnati, and they were the ones who made all the bottles in those days for the beer, Anheuser-Busch. And so they formed, these two men formed, they were interested in something new, and they hired my father as field superintendent in charge, and he went in and they developed a lease, a number of wells and all, and then they turned around and sold out the Standard for a big profit and sent him down. And of course, I had an older sister, Alberta, who died while they were still in Illinois. Shortly after that, and it was lucky for mother-in-law, they always thought, because they sent them on down to Shreveport, Louisiana area, and my father drilled some of the first wells around that area. And then they sold out that, and the Dutch Shell Company got in touch with him, and so at the time that he got his back broken when a pole fell with him, he was just filling in, getting bored, waiting in Marietta, Ohio, while they got some drilling equipment and all assembled, and the ship and all, and we were to go to India. And so I came that close. If he hadn't had his back all sliced up and everything, and it bothered him, and his back was stiff from just the base of his neck clear down to the pelvic region, because it was all crushed, and they actually laid a section of bone out of his leg down his back, and used silver wire and attached all the vertebrae and everything to it, and said he'd never be able to work hard, but he could boss and so forth. And that's one reason for buying that farm. He was recovering, and of course Dr. Stearns out of New York, specialist in repairing this type of thing, came to Lakeshore Hospital of Cleveland, Ohio, and he was operated on, and he was in the hospital for months there. But by the time we'd been in Pennsylvania for a couple of years, he was pitching hay and doing everything, and all. Unfortunately, he had some problems, and then the nervous system, whatnot, and the last several years of his life, he just lost it, and became actually had to be put in start with in the state hospital in Ohio. Then that was the hospital for the mentally ill. And then I was able to get him transferred to the Veterans Administration Psychiatric Hospital in Chillicothe, Ohio. And he dug out from under that fence in the winter. And I arrived there the evening of the day he was missed in the morning. And they had people out, and he went up in the hills there, was trying to hide out or something, and froze to death actually. So it was very sad. And I'm glad my mother had passed on beyond that time, but I had I could write quite a book about several years that my brother Bob and I tried to do something with him. It just became impossible. So in time, that injury, all what he suffered, did come back, and he just lost it, that's all.